Welcome to my first shot at a Counter-Apologetics workshop. This is prepared for Inland Empire Atheists and Agnostics and the Freethinkers around Redlands. Thank you guys for attending. My name is Eric Ozols. So a fair place to start, I think, is an introduction. I get this question a lot. What is apologetics? What is counter-apologetics? Well, if you read the meetup, I'm sure most of you are astute enough to have done so. Apologetics comes from the Latin root word of apologia, which means to give a defense for. So it's not exclusively a religious term, although that's where the richest tradition comes from, but you can be an apologetic for anything. You can be apologetic for the New England Patriots. You can be apologetic for, performance-enhancing drugs in baseball. You can give a defense for anything, but the most well-established tradition comes from the Christian faith, specifically. They kind of refined it, built it, and then everybody else kind of borrowed from those guys. Oftentimes, it gets conflated with other concepts, evangelism and proselytism. So the definitions I'm using today, when I use these terms, are apologetics is a reason, argument, or writing in justification of something, typically a theory or religious doctrine. Evangelism is spreading of a religious message by public preaching or personal witness. If you're dealing in Arabic or with a Muslim apologist, the phrase is dawah, which loosely translated means more like an invitation. They're inviting you to join their faith. Proselytism is an act of inviting or persuading converts, especially to a religious position. So the analogy I would use to understand these terms best, and it's not a big deal to get wrapped around about which term you're using and which, is this an apologetic, is this evangelism, is it proselytism? You can have all three wrapped up in one. They're not mutually exclusive. They can be separate sets and they can be co-located at the same time. So the analogy I use is kind of like a knight. So here's my Templar knight, right? The evangelism would be like his actions, his words, his message that he's spreading, right? Proselytism is more like his sword. It's like he's gouging in and trying to physically change them. That's his offensive weapon. But apologetics would be more like his sword, right? Or like his shield, right? That's his defensive mechanism. However, we've all been to medieval times where you've seen the movies where the knights fight and invariably the sword gets knocked out of his hand and he's got to use his shield as a defense mechanism or as an offensive weapon as well. So it's not that big of a deal about what term you're using at what time to get confused about how it works and what you're dealing with. But this is my little analogy for understanding the different ideas about how it works. So this is a workshop, it's not a lecture. It's going to look and feel like a lecture for most of this. I'm going to try and get a little bit of involvement here with the audience with you guys and to see what you want to get out of this. But because it's a workshop, if you were attending a workshop today on, say, changing a tire, when you walked out of here, I would expect you to have the desire to be able to change a tire, right? But we're not dealing with something tactile. We're dealing with concepts and ideas and emotions, right? And terms. So I threw up some objectives, some goals, what I would think I wanted to get out of this if I was on the other side. So I would want to know if you guys have any goals you want to throw on top of what I've got specifically. So I've got a familiarity with common arguments and tactics, introduction to techniques for crafting certain responses, visibility on some what I call trap doors. There's terms that get used very different ways. Somebody will use it one way and then they'll expect you to answer based upon that, and then they'll ask you a question back using the same rationale, using the word a different way. And I'll go through some of those. They'll be interspersed in some of what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. So does anybody have anything they want to add as a goal, something you'd like to get out of this? Anybody? Once, twice? Bueller? Okay, cool. I trust that they went over quite well. Go ahead, Phil.
Pull that mic down just a little bit.
Sure. I feel like I'm yelling at myself. Okay, these are things I would not classify as objectives, things I'm not trying to get done today. The goal is not to beat religious people. That's not the intent, okay? This is simply about elevating the conversation, about ameliorating ideas, jettisoning bad ideas and adopting good ideas whenever possible, or better ideas, if you will, more workable, more reliable methods, okay? It's not about beating people, browbeating people, or winning conversations. It's not about winning or losing. So it's not about winning arguments, because if you're in the argument to win, you've already lost. It's not about winning. It's about getting the best idea, letting that carry through the day, and getting rid of the worst ideas, okay? I would argue, though, that it is possible to lose, and you're going to lose if you're trying to win. You're going to lose if you're not trying to get the best idea or keep the best idea and get rid of the worst ideas. I would contend that this is not about deconverting anyone. You're not capable, some would disagree, but you're not capable of deconverting someone. This is something they're capable of doing on their own. You're just offering ideas and suggestions and alternative ways to think about these ideas that they come at you with, and using methods and techniques to better understand those ideas from different angles, okay? So it's not about deconverting them. They can deconvert themselves, but you're not inside somebody's head, so they can't do it. You can't do it for them. Debate. It's Phil does a series of a discussion series, and I prefer the term discussion. I prefer the idea of discussion because a discussion is a free exchange of ideas. It's not, I'm better than you, I'm trying to beat you. A debate is about winning or losing. There is a winner or lose. It's about persuading somebody. That's not the goal of counter-apologetics, or at least how I look at counter-apologetics. The goal is simply to have a discussion where, again, the best ideas carry the day and bad ideas are jettisoned off. Does anybody else have anything they would think to be worthwhile to add for something that is not an objective? Twice, 3 times a lady? Okay, thanks. Overview, a little bit we're going to do today, and I should give a caveat before we get started, because I can be long-winded and slightly verbose. I've got more material than is prepped for today. Not enough to fill up Phil's 12-hour camera there, but I've got more material than we're ready to do today because I'd rather have more and not need it than have less and need it, right? So just as an overview, we're going to talk a little bit about how I got here, some examples of some terms you're going to come across, what is expected of you, and then we might get into my philosophy, some of the stuff that's in my wheelhouse, which is a formal logic primer, some syllogisms, and possibly some representative questions, different ideas and ways to approach some of those concepts that come at you, okay? So the impetus for this came last year when I was at a dinner with FAR, and I heard somebody say, hey, or Freethinkers around Redlands, I heard somebody say, hey, we should have a meeting where we get somebody together and show us what all the arguments are and how to respond to those arguments. I like that idea, and that's where I got the idea from, although that gives the impression of it's a little bit of like a paint-by-numbers approach, which is, it can look that way sometimes, especially when it comes to like the classical arguments, which we'll get into a little bit, which we can get into in great depth if you like. It's not so much about when person says ABC, then you say XYZ, and boom, bam, day's over. It doesn't work like that. You kind of need to modulate your approach and conform to what they're giving you and specifically address the topics they bring up, because it can get real easy to go, oh, I'm listening to the Kalam cosmological argument or the teleological argument or whatever the case may be, and just go right into stop listening to them, waiting for your chance to respond. And we are trying to model the behavior we would like them to emulate, right, which is listening to the entire idea and then getting out your response, okay? So that's where it came from, and I thought that's a good idea. That's why I volunteered to do this right now, is because that's why I heard somebody ask that question, and they wanted to hear this discussion. So here we are. About me, I'll give a slight caveat here. When I'm having a discussion with a religious interlocutor, which is a fancy word for conversation participant, they always invariably ask, you get 3 or 4 questions into this, and they realize you're prepared for this conversation. You know what you're talking about a little bit. And they very quickly want to know, how were you raised? What's your religious background? And I frequently won't tell them. And it's just simply because it's irrelevant. You have a sales position. You have a pitch. You have a supernatural entity that you are trying to convince me exists, right? Whether I was raised as a Mormon or Jehovah's Witness or secular or anything else, your version of a supernatural entity exists. That's binary. Either exists or it doesn't exist. How I was raised is completely irrelevant. What they're doing is they're looking for a way to prejudice you. And everybody prejudges everything. You prejudice everything. It gets a really bad rap because bigotry is very bad. But sometimes prejudice can actually be very helpful, because if you're in the jungle and there's a lion there, it is a good idea to prejudge him that he wants to eat you, right? So prejudice cannot always be a bad thing. Bigotry is a bad thing. But they're trying to prejudice you. And just because I may or may not have been raised in their particular religion doesn't mean I don't have something worthwhile to say or an opinion that's important or valuable in some way, right? So in the same way that just because a person may not have children doesn't mean they can't have a good opinion about corporal punishment, okay? They're not going to be quite as intimately involved as a parent, but they still have something worthwhile to say. So I frequently won't tell them, and I'll call them out. I'll say, well, if I told you I was a garbage man, you're going to think certain things about my socioeconomic and my educational background, but that may or may not be true. I could be a garbage man with a PhD. There are rocket scientists out there that are highly educated derelicts. It happens, okay? So I don't tell them, just as a side note. About me specifically, the reason I'm interested in this topic is because, full disclosure, I fly jets for a living. I got hired by an airline in 2007, and they were owned by a close-knit Mormon family in a small town in Utah. And when you're a new co-pilot on an airline, they put you with senior guys who have to read through the manuals, and you have to know, the knee bones connected to the ankle bone. The ankle bone is connected to the foot bone in the airplane, right? And there's a certain curriculum they've got to follow. Well, because it's a Mormon airline, they tend to hire Mormon guys, so they would make this really smooth segue where they'd reach down and pull out the Book of Mormon and slap it right on top of the manual they were reading from and make it seem like it was my job to listen to their proselytism, evangelizing, right? It was a very shocking moment. I was like, whoa, what are you doing? And this didn't happen one time, this happened repeatedly. And being a contemplative fellow, I engaged in this discussion, and what they were saying to me, I knew, for lack of a better term, was bullshit. In the same way you would know, sitting next to someone on an airplane who told you that Xenu dropped souls into the volcanoes of Hawaii, and that's how we have bad feelings in the world, Scientology. In the same way you would know that's nonsense, I knew what they were saying was nonsense, but I lacked the tools and understanding to explain to them specifically how each one of their ideas was fallacious or erroneous, whatever the case may be. So being a Mormon-owned airline, you may not know this, but the Marriott brothers of the Marriott hotel chain are very high up on the hierarchy of the Mormon church. They're not quite in the Quorum of 12, which is like their oligarchy in Salt Lake City, but they're within seeing distance of the Quorum of 12 over there. So being a Mormon-owned airline, we stay at Marriott hotels a lot. So I open up the nightstand, and lo and behold, there's what they call the Holy Bible, and then there's what they call the Book of Mormon right next to it. So I pull them out. And 10 or 15 days later, I've got the Book of Mormon read front to back. So I start having these conversations at 35,000 feet with this guy, and the conversation gets a little more interesting because now I'm discussing from a position of knowledge as a position of, I don't know what you're saying, but I know it's wrong. That's not a great position. That's an uncomfortable position to be in. So I wanted to know, right? The conversations kind of tapered down a little bit when you start to understand what they're talking about. And they say, oh, the book says this. And you say, well, yeah, it says that, but it also says this. And they're like, whoa, I never read that part before. No kidding. So by analogy, and my analogies are not always congruent, I apologize, do the best I can. The Book of Mormon, Muslims would disagree, but the Book of Mormon is basically equivalent to like the Return of the Jedi, right? It's like the third episode, although technically it's the sixth episode, but it's the third episode culturally that we think about, right? With what Protestants call pejoratively the Old Testament being selective readings from the Talmud and the Torah, and then the book of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, with the writings of Paul being the New Testament, right? So the Holy Testament, or the Holy Bible, is basically episodes 1 and 2, and then the Book of Mormon or the Quran, depending on who tells you, would be the third in the series, right? Well, I'd read the third in the series, and it's a little devoid of context if you haven't read the first two in the first place. So this led me inquisitively to read the Holy Bible. So I read the Bible, which made me insatiable. I was listening to every podcast, reading every book, watching every YouTube video you could find on this stuff, and I've basically been involved in that world, thinking that way for over 10 years now. So that's how I got here. That doesn't make me an expert in anything. It just means I was really enthusiastic about it for a really long time. That being said, I should offer some disclaimers. You do not have to agree with me about what I say, okay? You do not have to adopt the techniques that I use, okay? You can find your own techniques. You don't even have to engage in this discussion. But if you're interested enough to be here, my assumption is you're looking for some ideas about how to handle these discussions. I am not the patron saint of Counter-Apologetics. I'm just a regular guy, okay? I'm nobody special. I don't do this stuff professionally. I don't have any formal degrees in this stuff. I'm just a regular guy. So I may get things wrong, and that's fair. I'm okay with that. So that's my disclaimers before we get going here. I want to give you guys a little bit of an illustrative example here. I am a woo master, and I'm going to regress all of you. So there's your woo, okay? I'm regressing all of you to 7 years old, and you're starting out second grade, okay? And it's math day, all right? You're going to learn your multiplication tables. Do you remember being 7 years old and looking at your multiplication tables? It seemed, to me at least, like a daunting task, like, oh my gosh, that's hard. I'm never going to be able to figure that out, right? I mean, look at all this information. That's a lot of stuff, right? And counter-apologetics kind of works this way. Apologetics kind of works this way. When you first delve into this world, you realize there's a lot of material here. There's a lot of stuff going on. But maybe your teacher gave you some techniques, some pattern recognition, something to look for in the numbers, in the information itself, that can help simplify this model, right? So when you think about multiplication now as an adult, you don't think of when somebody gives you a number, some obscure number, you start from what you know, and then you work towards what you don't know, right? Like, we all know the fives. Fives are easy. They just roll off your tongue. 5, 10, 15, 20, right? The tens, those roll off your tongue. Once you know the tens, you know the nines. Twos are easy. Fours are easy because they're right next to 5. You follow me? And everything kind of interpolates from those points of knowledge, right? So with counter-apologetics in the same way, there's like a dawning moment of comprehension. And I apologize for the resolution because I'm not good with computers. So that that's what you get. But the reason I put this up there is because at some point when you were doing these multiplication tables as a kid, you realized there was a pattern. It wasn't just about 5s and 9s and 10s and 2s and 1s and whatever else the case may be, but you realized it was a mirror image on the top and the bottom. And for me, that was that moment where I'm like, oh, this is not quite as cosmic as it seems. And counter-apologetics works in a similar way because there's really only a certain number of ways to have this discussion when somebody walks up to you and they've got something to sell you. They've got an idea to sell you, okay? So this is borrowed from Sam Harris, and he says there are 3 ways of discussing this topic, of discussing religion. The first one is my supernatural claims are true. And when I say true, that's a colloquialism. I'm using it in a colloquial way. That's one of those trapdoors I talked about, which was going to be interspersed in here. True can mean multiple different things. How do we get true? Is true and truth equal? Blah, blah, blah. So there's only one way to, there's 3 ways to talk about this. The first one is my claims are true. My religion is useful. Look at all the charity work we do. Look at all the services we provide. Look at all the people that are helped out by this. The third way is everyone else is bad. So if you don't agree with me, then you're bad, okay? This is pretty much it. Now, when I'm discussing online, which is where I cut most of my teeth, I spent a lot of time on Reddit and Palringo and different debate pages, gained a little bit of pseudo-fame on the internet, and I kind of ran out of people to discuss with, so I kind of moved out into the real world. When I'm having these discussions with somebody online, I frequently remind them that options 2 and 3 are completely irrelevant until we've established number 1. Until we figured out that your religious beliefs are true, whether it's useful or whether everyone else is bad, don't matter in the slightest, because we could have gotten that use somewhere else, and people are bad for different reasons than not believing in your claim, because your claim has not been established as true, okay? Matt Dillahunty, he gives a slightly different version of this. It's kind of the same idea of 1 and 2. He says every argument for the accuracy of a religion comes down to it's either an argument for the existence of a colloquial God, supernatural deity, or belief in God. So to me, that would be 1 and 2. So my belief is useful. It's an argument for belief in God, or my religious claims are true. So that's how he starts his division. I think about it in 3 ways. It's not that much different, to be honest with you. So some of the things you're going to run into, types of apologetics, and all of this qualifies as rhetoric, okay? Certain things you're going to run into on the street or in discussions online, or even just sitting next to somebody on the street, or even listening to an apologist on the news or somebody talking like Dinesh D'Souza or William Lane Craig or some of the famous names of guys that are known in the apologetic circle. Frank Turek, somebody I listen to. These are just some of the techniques you're going to come across, okay? And I'm going to give just a few words here on each one. And there's quite a few of them. This is just a sampling set. This is not a comprehensive list by any means, okay? Bait and switch is a tactic. It's actually a sales tactic. It's illegal. Where they'll advertise in a newspaper or on the radio or on TV. They'll say, hey, we've got a $7,000 car. And you show up at 7 o'clock in the morning and they've only got $35,000 cars on the lot. You go, wait a minute, what happened to those $7,000 cars you have? And they go, oh, all those are out on test drives and we sold all those out in the first few minutes. They're baiting you with the deal and then they're going to switch it as soon as you get there. They never had this deal in the first place. They just make it seem like that, right? So a lot of these terms, a lot of these apologetics we run into are very bait and switch oriented, where they'll tell you, oh, I'm being objective and not subjective. And then when you dig down, you pull a couple layers off, they're not being objective, they're being subjective. They're offering or they're advertising fiction, but they've only got, or they're advertising facts, but they've only got fiction to sell, okay? This is a bait and switch technique. Appeal to emotion. My grandmother's on her deathbed and I don't want to tell her that I'm secular. I don't want to tell her that I don't believe those claims anymore. She lived her entire life that way. My child died in a horrific way. They're tragic, awful accidents, and nobody, my heart goes out to them. I empathize for sure, but it doesn't make a religious claim true. It just makes it a sad story about why you believe your religion. This is a type of rhetoric, a type of apologetic you're going to run into very frequently. Argument from authority. Everybody does this. The fancy Latin name is argumentum ad verecundium. If you're really trying to sound like a smarty pants, you can memorize the Latin names. Nobody's really interested. It's more about the fallacy specifically. And if you've studied fallacies, you're going to notice a lot of overlap specifically on these, because Aaron Ross says all arguments for the existence of a supernatural deity are logical fallacies, and all logical fallacies are arguments for supernatural deities. Almost. Pretty close. Not exactly. There's a little bit. I could probably find an example here that doesn't qualify. But for the most part, a lot of them are. A lot of our language, a lot of our concepts come from Western culture, which was very religiously, our ancestors were very religious people. So, and they developed our language. Argument from authority. Very smart person, very educated person says X, X must be the case. Well, sure, that may be the case, but just because a smart person says it doesn't make it the case. And it's not technically a fallacy if the person actually is an expert in the subject and they are correct. So you can be an expert in the subject and still be wrong about something that you've come to a conclusion on after all your studies in academics. It's only a fallacy if the person is actually wrong or they're not technically an authority, but it never makes it accurate. Begging the question, we see this frequently. Circular arguments, affirming the consequent is similar, but this is where you start with your conclusion and then you offer reason why, and then you conclude your conclusion, which circles back around to where you started from the first place. Begging the question, we see it very commonly.
Give us an example, Eric.
I actually have one deep in here. Let's see if I can get to it. All right. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. What's going on here? In the first premise, okay, and this is a syllogism, in the first premise, if God does not exist, God, as defined, is a being that exists, okay? If a being that does not exist, if a being that exists does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. What is that? That's a double negative, right? Does anybody notice that from 9th grade English class? That's a double negative. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. So if you were to rewrite that, right? Oops. If you were to rewrite that, you get rid of this not and get rid of that not. Well, you can't just say it the way it is because then it would say if God does exist. You got to rewrite the entire premise, right? So if you boil this whole thing down, what that first premise is God exists. That's it. That's all you get after that whole premise if you get rid of the double negative. So really what they're saying is God exists, therefore God exists. That's a circular argument. That's begging the question, okay? Is that what you're looking for, Reb?
Yeah.
All right. Straw manning is enormous, okay? The term, I don't know exactly where it comes from, but it's basically if you can imagine me giving a presentation, I'm saying, oh, here's a religious argument that somebody's going to make. My opponent makes this argument, and I've got a pile of straw, and I build a big man out of straw, and I say, look at my opponent's argument. See how silly it is? It's only made of straw. And here's how you defeat that argument. And then you punch that straw man, and the whole thing falls on the floor. That's straw manning. It's when you build your opponent's argument for him in a fallacious attempt to present his side not accurately, right? You don't let him make his own opinion, or you don't make him make his own argument. You make it for him, but you leave out the parts that are inconvenient for the way you want to see things, okay? That's straw manning. It happens all the time. This is somebody putting words in your mouth and then asking you to defend those words they put into your mouth, okay? Something I call the confusion transfer, and this is an original. They are confused about something, and they're trying to infect you with that confusion. I don't understand something, and look, you don't understand it either because of the way I'm going to phrase this, and I'm going to use weighted, loaded language in a leading question, and I'm going to infect you with that confusion. So they're confused about something, and they're just trying to transfer it into you, and this is one of the big things that I focus on, specifically on the counters. False comparisons, this is something we run into all the time where you're comparing things that are not equitable. You're comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing apples and celestial bodies. We ran into this in one of Phil's last discussions where they were talking about micro versus macro evolution, and the creation intelligent design proponent was comparing watches, William Paley's watch argument's a classic, to organic structures. Well, watches are made of inorganic material, and biomaterial is different. Biomaterial self-regenerates. It self-replicating bits, cells, right? And the example I gave was if you put me in a cell and you break my ankle and you give me food and water and you come back in a year, my ankle is going to heal up. But if you put a watch in a cell and you give it food and water and you smash it with a sledgehammer, it's still going to be broken a year later, right? So they're comparing things that are not equal. They're comparing inorganic substances with organic substances and saying, oh, look, this is why it doesn't work. That's a false comparison. The Gish-Gallop is something you're going to run into almost every time. It's where your opponent gives you, your opponent is a bad term, it's bad phrasing, but a religious interlocutor or an apologetic is going to give you so much information. They're going to give you so many ideas and so many arguments that you can't possibly handle them all. And frequently it's by design. I've got a good example of that in a couple of slides here. It's by design. They do it on purpose because then they know it's almost like playing tennis where they've got an idea, a ball, and they hit that idea into your court. And then you've got only one racket and you can hit that ball back in and you can see the spin and the speed and the angle and the velocity, and you can see if they use their hips and their shoulders and their backs and how they hit, what direction the racket was going afterwards. And then you can modulate your return back over the net, right? Well, if he or she throws you 1,000 tennis balls, you've only got one to hit back. And all those balls that get by you on ESPN, they're going to go, look at all the balls that got by him. Well, yeah, you're going to let some get by you. That's part of the gish gallop. They do it on purpose. And then every argument that isn't refuted or isn't addressed now looks like it's been validated because it stands on its own because it wasn't addressed. That's intentional. A data drop is similar. It's something we see more online. It's when you're having a discussion with somebody and you're saying, well, there isn't sufficient credible evidence for this claim, and you're being hypocritical with that because you wouldn't accept the same idea for somebody else's religion. And they'll say, oh yeah, well, here's a link to the Institute for Creation Research or Answers in Genesis, and you open up that file and it's a 500-page PDF that would take you the rest of the day to sit and read through the entire thing. They know you can't respond. They know you can't address every subject, and every page has 15 or 16 different kinds of science you would have to study to actually learn to refute each one of those things accurately. They know that, and they know you can't possibly do that. And they'll say, I'm not reading that. Do your own homework. And they'll say, well, you're not even serious about this conversation. That's a data drop. They're trying to inundate you with nonsense. Virtue signaling. This is everywhere. It's not every single time you see a crucifix or a Star of David or any other religious symbol, but a lot of times with the T-shirts and the signs and the singing and whatever else the case may be, they're virtue signaling. They're showing you, look, we are part of the in-group. We are part of the clan. We are part of the tribe, and you are part of the out-group if you're not part of this club, right? They're virtue signaling. That is a type of apologetic. That is a type of defending their turf by marking it. I mean, they might as well walk around peeing on every big rock in the jungle, right? Condescension. This is huge. I had a conversation last year with a gentleman on the street in Redlands, and we talked for 45 minutes, and it was a very amicable discussion. And we got through maybe 5 or 6 of his arguments, and he realized he just had nothing. It just wasn't there. And he dropped into this very hat in hand, and he goes, well, all that stuff is great, and you sure do know a lot of stuff, but I've got a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and I'm going to go to heaven, and you're just going to burn in hell for eternity. And I just feel really bad for you. And just that tone in and of itself. Now, that's bait. He's trying to get me to take the bait, but he's using just his tone of voice specifically just to talk down to you because he's run out of stuff to say and you've resoundingly refuted everything he said before that. So he's just looking for a way that he can walk away and go, well, I gained the upper hand on that one, right? That's condescension. Happens all the time. Classic arguments, we can dig through one of those. We can dig through all of those in depth, but because it's a series, we got to get through some of these specifically. Another page of apologetics types you're going to run into. Scarcity. This is kind of like the fire sale where everything must go and it's got to go by Tuesday and you better get over here right now and you better get a hold of it because it's going to be gone if you don't get here, right? Everything must go. It's a sales technique that gives you that sense of urgency. I've got to make the decision right now. If you ever watch The Way of the Master with Ray Comfort and Kirk Cameron, I'm a complete masochist. I watch all that stuff. They do that to everybody. You could die tonight. They try to put that fear into you. You could die tonight, Les. What are you going to do about it? You better get right with Jesus. And you're like, oh, and you see these people on the street, and it makes you, there's a cognitive bias where it makes you make rash decisions. And when you make rash decisions, you make less rational decisions. No, I didn't plan for that to work out that well. Coercion. This is the hell in heaven. This is the carrot and the stick. This is where if you fall in line, if you accept these ideas, you're going to get all the good things. If you don't accept them, you're going to get all the bad things. Obfuscation. We run into this nonstop. Almost all these can overlap. They can come in different forms, and you can see them come up every time. But specifically trying to confuse the situation with something else, or you'll ask them a direct question, and they will talk about another subject that they think is related. That's obfuscating. You see the pundits and the talking heads and the press secretaries do this stuff all the time for both political parties. It's almost their job. Pettifogging is when they realize that they don't have anything really useful or ethical to say, so they'll make it about something else. They'll focus on some minutia in the discussion specifically, and they'll make it about that. It's not about the subject, it's become about the minutia because they're just trying to draw it out. They're trying to elongate the discussion because they don't really have anything else to talk about of substance. Vague terms. Daniel Dennett calls these deepities. You hear this all the time with cosmological arguments, first cause arguments. They'll say, oh, famous scientist, Lawrence Krauss or Stephen Hawking or Kip Thorne says the universe came from nothing and they've got a definition for nothing. And they'll say, oh, he's not really talking about nothing, he's talking about something because Lawrence Krauss says nothing is a quantum vacuum, right? Okay, well, I'm not smarter than Lawrence Krauss and I'm not going to try to put words in his mouth. But they'll say, that's not nothing, that's something, and nothing is what rocks dream about, right? Well, that's a vague deepity that they're not really said anything. There's no substance there because they're just trying to throw the conversation off. That's a vague, or what Daniel Dennett calls a deepity. Gaslighting, this is a term that's gotten some press recently. It's generally thought of as like an abusive relationship term where the abusing party will tell the abused party that you're going insane. You can't trust yourself. What you think is wrong. Everyone else is lying to you. Only I'm telling you the truth. Only I love you. No one else will ever love you like that. That's gaslighting. That's putting somebody in a little bubble where you're trying to control everything that goes around them. You'll see apologetics do this. Only we have the capital T truth, Seitan Bruggenkate, that kind of stuff. That's gaslighting. It's got a little bit to do with a couple of these other ones real quick, and I'll try to burn through these. Solipsism. I could talk for about an hour just on solipsism itself. It's the matrix where you could be a brain in a vat. You can't trust your senses. And there's different kinds of solipsism. There's the soft solipsism, which René Descartes tried to solve by saying, I think, therefore I am, cognito ergo sum. He's saying, well, I can't really know that the room is really lit right now, or that I'm standing in a room, or this is a lectern, or whatever else the case may be, because all of my senses could be lying to me, but I know that I'm thinking, so I know that I must exist because I'm thinking. Well, that's solipsism. That's how René Descartes tried to solve just solipsism. But then there's another level to this, which is hard solipsism, which is, yeah, but a computer could be feeding your brain a vat right now, telling it it's thinking. So then you could say, well, I think I'm thinking, therefore I am. But there's another layer, because then you got to go, I think I'm thinking, therefore I am. And this goes on ad infinitum. So far as I know, no one has solved this conundrum. I have not claimed to have solved this conundrum either. And apologists absolutely love this stuff because they could spend all day talking about how you can't know reality. You can't know the truth. You could be a brain in a vat. This could be the matrix right now. The problem is they also acknowledge they have the same problem. It's called external world skepticism. It's a classic philosophical problem. They can't solve it either, but they'll go, well, yeah, but then blah, 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 therefore my claimed version of a supernatural deity, my God. I'm sorry, that just doesn't follow, okay? Anyways, we could talk for hours about that stuff. Deflecting is a lot like obscurantism. You ask somebody a question, and they don't answer the specific question. They want to talk about something else. Sophistry gets conflated sometimes with solipsism because it looks alike, but they're totally different. Sophistry is very cleverly worded, convincing, persuasive, wrong arguments. Ultimately wrong, but they sound very smooth and very convincing and very, very smartly put together. That's sophistry. The Roadrunner tactic is, I think it was made famous by Frank Turek or Norman Geisler in their books. It's when you ask someone, or it's when somebody asks you a question, when you ask someone a question, and then they will turn right back around and they'll say, apply that same standard to the same question itself in an erroneous fashion. Sometimes that's very useful, but when it's erroneous or when it's based on a mistaken understanding of levels of talking about things, or what I'll talk about in a few minutes, which is the analytic and synthetic distinction, it is fallacious. Does absolute truth exist? No, absolute truth does not exist. Is that a true statement? That's roadrunning. They're trying to, remember the Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner cartoons from the Looney Tunes? That's what they're trying to do, is because the Wile E. Coyote always got caught up in his own trap every single time he tried to catch a Roadrunner, right? Well, that's what they're trying to do, is they're trying to say, oh, look, you're caught up in your own trap. You don't understand this thing. It's just we're talking about different levels and different ways of using these terms. That's why I say some of these terms are trapdoors. Burden shifting, almost every single time, has a lot to do with putting words in somebody's mouth, straw manning. They'll walk up to you and they'll say, oh, you believe something came from nothing. Ha, 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 prove it. Wait a minute, hold on a second. No, I didn't make that claim. You're putting words in my mouth. You're ascribing positions to me I don't actually hold, and then you're asking me to prove that. You have a claim. You have a sales pitch. It's your job to convince me of that, provide sufficient credible evidence for that claim. Goalpost shifting constantly. We see this this usually comes up most notably in the evolution, biological evolution through natural selection and creationism discussion, where they'll say, oh, show me, what's going to convince you that biological evolution is correct? Oh, well, give me one example, not in a lab, observed, of a species changing into another species. Okay, well, here's I don't know, pick your critter, Tiktaalik, okay? Half crocodile, half fish looking thing that walked on the land. He had fins, right? Oh, well, that's a separate species. And even if it did fit between those two species, you just got two more holes on there. They're shifting the goalpost. You asked them specifically, what would convince you that you're wrong? And they would say, oh, this, you gave it to them. And then they say, oh, no, that doesn't work. Now you got two more problems to solve. That's goalpost shifting. A great example of this is Lee Strobel. And I could talk for a couple hours on Lee Strobel. I've read all his books. He's an interesting fella. I think he's a professor at some Bible college in Houston or seminary or something like that. And just even his Twitter handle says actually apologetics in it. So he is an apologetic and he's an evangelical as well. So I'm going to read this word for word, and then we're going to go back through the first two slides and see how many of those specific apologetics he's using and layering on there. He's got 65 words in here, give or take, almost. I counted them exactly what they were. I forgot. So he says, looking at the doctrine of Darwinism, which undergirded my atheism for so many years, it didn't take me long to conclude that it was simply too far-fetched to be credible. I realized that if I were to embrace Darwinism and its underlying premise of naturalism, I would have to believe that nothing produces everything, non-life produces life, randomness produces fine-tuning, chaos produces information, unconsciousness produces consciousness, non-reason produces reason, the central pillars of evolutionary theory quickly rotted away when exposed to scrutiny. So if you're interested, I can send you the slide, but this is him using almost every one of these types of apologetics in just 65 words, okay? Remember earlier the analogy I gave about playing tennis, okay? This is you, all right? She's having a good time, but she's really only able to see one of those balls at one time. But here's Lee Strobel hitting about 55 balls at her at once in less than 65 words, give or take. So I went back through this looking at myself, and I don't think he invoked solipsism. I don't think he invoked... that might be the only one. There might be a couple others in here. But of all these, and this is just a sampling. This is only a small selection of all the types you're going to run into. Here's Lee Strobel. So if you agree to engage in this discussion, this is what you're going to feel like. This is what you're agreeing to do. You're giving yourself a huge disadvantage, a huge lower hand, right, as juxtaposed with an upper hand, right, in this discussion. If you elect to do so, you don't have to do anything. Okay? You don't have to say anything. You don't have to engage. Again, they have the burden of proof. It's their responsibility to validate and prove that claim. Proof is another trapdoor term. You don't have to do anything. Okay? If you should choose to do something, I offer these as tools to you. Okay? From my years of being an angry internet atheist. All right? Just like with multiplication tables, there's a pattern here. Okay? Specifically with the classic arguments. And there's 4 or 5 or 6, depending on how you classify them. And we can go through each one of those. There was, St. Anselm came up with the ontological argument, or gets credit for coming up with the ontological argument. And then Aquinas came up with the other 5 or 6 Catholics, for European Catholic types. If you recognize the patterns in keywords, they all have keywords. If you recognize the pattern in phrasing, you'll notice that they tend to follow a similar script, a similar pattern. Okay? And once you engage in this more than a few times, you'll start seeing that pattern as the keywords come out. You'll start recognizing, oh, he's driving it towards this argument or that other case, right? That's where it can feel like a little bit of a paint by numbers approach, where person says X, I'm going to say Y. I would discourage you to think of it that way, but it's always going to end up kind of feeling that way sometimes because, like I said, there's only so many ways to have this discussion from their angle. So some, just as an example, counter-apologetics, anything. If you're skeptical, if you're not credulous, and you respond in any way, you are using counter-apologetics. Now, you can be a jerk and you can say, you're dumb and walk away. I highly discourage that, okay? You don't win many flies with that vinegar, right? But that does technically count as a counter-apologetic. I would not encourage that. If you choose to have an amicable discussion, okay, discussion, not debate, there are some tactics that I think are more useful than others. Question the question. And I'm going to give a little example here about a discussion I had in this room, actually, about how that works. But we're going to talk a little bit more about these real quick. Expose some of those fallacies. You don't have to memorize fallacies. If you go to rationalwiki.org, there's about 150, 175 logical fallacies in there. There's all different kinds. There's formal, and there's informal, and there's style, and there's different kinds of fallacies. You don't have to be an expert in that kind of stuff, but you can recognize it when you see it, right? Hypocrisy. Show them how their own idea doesn't apply when using their own standards, okay? And it's not the same thing as Roadrunner because Roadrunner is fallacious in nature. Definition, specifically ask them, how are you using this word? How are you using that word? Does it apply in every situation in the same sentence if I were to ask you the same question back again using a different example? And this is one of my very favorites is counter-example. And this is the discussion, and this is the first time we can get a little bit of interaction here. So I was in this room, and we were getting ready to shoot one of the videos for Phil's series, and I was actually going to be on camera, and I'm just walking around because I've got restless leg syndrome. I can't sit still. So I'm walking around, and a gentleman had cornered Reb and said, I hope I can phrase this exactly right. He said, is it possible a miracle has happened in an alternate dimension? Okay, so just a little bit of context. The first dimension is just the x-axis you can plot on a number line, basically. The second dimension is the y-axis. You can plot anything in a square, and then you can go on all the different quadrants on a y-axis. The z-axis is when it comes out this direction. That's the third dimension. You can plot basically anything in the universe on a third dimension. The fourth dimension is time, the one we're experiencing right now, space-time. And then much smarter guys than me say there's fifth, sixth, all the way to 10, 11, 12, maybe more dimensions. I don't know. That's basically what he was asking her, is a little bit of a vagary, a little bit of a deepity type question, right? He said, is it possible that a miracle has happened in an alternate dimension that we're not aware of? Does anybody have any ideas? How would you address that?
Well, we cannot see it because it's not our dimension.
Sure.
So in theory, yes, something could happen, but we cannot see it. It's not our dimension.
Okay. Fair, yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, it's not right or wrong. There is no right or wrong. It's purely subjective.
Yeah.
You're having a discussion with an apologist. Anybody else? I'll start picking on people. No, I'm just playing. Okay, I'll just tell you what I said, not right, wrong, or indifferent. I used some of these techniques specifically, and I gave him a counterexample. I asked him, I said, how are you using the word miracle? The question was, is it possible that a miracle happened in another dimension? And I said, how are you using the word miracle? And he said, a miracle is something you don't know. Okay, so then I gave him, by far one of the best, I gave him a counterexample. I said, okay, there's a woman standing there. And I said, I don't know where she was born. Does that mean where she was born is miraculous? No, that doesn't apply when you apply it back to itself, right? He goes, oh, wait, hold on a second. I can't defend that ground. So he retreats. He backs up a little bit. And he goes, well, a miracle is something you can't measure. Okay, so he changed his definition, which is fine. So I gave him a counterexample using his new definition. And I said, okay, if a miracle is something you can't measure, how long was Jesus of Nazareth dead for? Without missing a beat, right? He's a fundamentalist, young earth, evangelical Christian. He said 3 days. And I didn't say anything. I just held up the number 3. This is the European 3. Americans say 3. This is the European 3, okay? I said, that's a measurement. I said, you just told me he was dead for 3 days, right? If a miracle is something you can't measure, then you can't measure it, right? Well, I know he's not going to defend that Jesus' resurrection is not a miracle. That's Pauline scripture. You can't do that under no circumstances, right? I must defend that to the end. So his eyes were as wide as dinner plates at this point. I'm not saying, oh, look how I beat this guy. I'm not. I'm just simply questioning the question, asking him how he's using these terms, and then giving him counter examples of those terms that he's using to show him, because I can't convince him by himself, right? Only he can convince himself. I can just expose some of these assumptions that he's made in these comments and these ideas, right? And then let him figure out what's wrong with what he's saying on his own. This is Pascal. Pascal gets a lot of bad press because of his wager, but he actually had some really smart things to say. And he's like, if you show somebody the error and let them figure it out for themselves, it's going to stick with them much, much longer, as opposed to when you just tell them, that's wrong because of X, Y, Z. If you just ask them Socratic method-wise, just ask them questions specifically about what they're saying, let them figure out what they did wrong by showing them how they don't apply that same standard or whatever else the case may be. Just a technique, just an idea of a conversation that I had. Another, some would argue, is the most powerful method you have of counter-apologetics is the outsider test. John W. Loftus is a brilliant philosopher. He wrote 3 books. He wrote a book in 2013 called The Outsider Test for Faith. And it's basically a book long, I believe in one fewer God than you. I go one God further. That whole idea that you can filter through somebody's brain, and the more times you can filter through that brain, that they see the claims of Hinduism or Sikhism, where we live in the Western Hemisphere, so almost everybody here is safe to say, Christian background. Not all, but I'm generalizing and stereotyping, of course. But if you can get them to understand that you see the same reason to think their claim is valid that they see to think someone else's claim is valid. That's basically the outsider test for faith. Read the book. It's fascinating. You'll love it. Again, keywords. Find those phrases. That's part of the pattern recognition. That's your 5s in the multiplication tables and your 10 in the multiplication tables. You find those keywords and that, oh, this guy's talking about the ontological, this guy's talking about the teleological or the anthropic principle, because they always have to get out design, creation, nothing. They've always got to get out a few keywords. Once you hear those keywords, I know what direction he's going, but you got to listen to the whole thing because sometimes they throw out weird spins on things. Phrasing, same idea. Okay, so analytics versus synthetics. If I had a magic wand and I could wave it over the universe, over the earth, and I could fix one cognitive problem, I would fix an argument from ignorance, okay? Argument from ignorance is, we don't know, therefore God. Well, cause and effect, right? We have necessary causes and sufficient causes. God doesn't follow from I don't know. I don't know follows from I don't know, okay? The only thing that follows from I don't know is I don't know. However, everybody says, my God follows from I don't know. You don't know what, quote, caused the Big Bang. You don't know why we have abiogenesis. You don't know, the smartest scientists in the world don't know, therefore God. That's an argument from ignorance to the T. If I could fix one thing in the brains of every person on earth, I would fix an argument from ignorance. If I could fix two things, I would fix analytics versus synthetics is the second thing. And this is my very favorite counter-apologetic. And I've got a couple slides, but because when you're having these discussions, you're not always going to have handy-dandy visual aids to remember this stuff by. So I use my hands, and I'm on the street, and I say, okay, I'm going to give you two statements, okay? And we're going to determine together, we're going to assign truth values to these statements, or accuracy values to these statements, right? Okay. So the first statement is, all bachelors are unmarried. And the second statement is, all bachelors can swim, okay? So the first statement, just like, I use a lot of math analogies, just like when you were in probably what, 6th or 7th grade, you started algebra and you started doing order of operations. Remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, right? Remember that stuff? Where if you started solving the math problem and you did your division before you did your parentheses, or you did your addition before you did your exponents, you were invariably going to get the wrong answer every single time, right? You had to follow a very specific order of operations. Well, analytics versus synthetics, when evaluating ideas, works in a very similar way, okay? The foundation is analytics. So the first statement is what we call an analytic statement. All bachelors are unmarried. So what we can do is we can go through and analyze that statement word for word. All, okay, bachelors. How do we want to use the word bachelors? I'm going to propose that we use unmarried man, okay? So you take that word and you plug it back into the sentence. In the same way, when your teacher gave you 4x equals y, like, well, it's solved until you tell me what one of these is worth. Okay, x is equal to 2. You take that 2 and you plug it back into the statement, right? You just intersperse it right back in the statement. You got 4 times 2 equals y. Okay, must be 8. Y must be equal to 8. Done, right? Well, in analytics, you do the same thing. So unmarried man, you're going to plug that right back into the statement. All unmarried men are unmarried men, right? Is this a true statement? It's 100% true in 100% of the scenarios. There's no way it can be wrong, right? By definition. You ever hear that phrase? True by definition. You hear this all the time. It's true by definition. It's true by definition. Are they complimenting or are they denigrating the idea? Colloquially, when you hear the talking heads on cable news, they're actually complimenting the idea. They're saying, it's true by definition. Oh, well, you can't argue with it. It must be true by definition. However, when you get into more formal logic ideas and terms, they're actually denigrating the statement. They're saying it's only true because you've defined these words that way. Where do definitions come from? They come from us. We are subjective agents. We decided to call bachelor as a mental construct to convey an idea back and forth between each other about unmarried man. It's simply shorthand about, so I don't have to say unmarried man all the time. I can just say bachelor. That's what language is. That's how we got our words. It's purely subjective. So all unmarried men are unmarried men. It's 100% true and 100% situation. This is what we call an analytic statement. Okay, so jump the fence with me. All unmarried men can swim. All bachelors can swim, okay? So remember the foundation, the order of operations? The first thing we gotta do is we gotta analyze a statement, okay? So analyze a statement. All unmarried men can swim. Let's just say swim is not drown in deep water. Okay, fine. So all unmarried men can not drown in deep water. Are we done? No. We're not done. We have more to do, right? Because this is a synthetic statement. It's a statement that's making a claim about the world around us. You can't just assign a truth value off of the words alone. By analyzing the word, there's another layer here, order of operations. This is a synthetic statement, okay? I'm making a claim about the world around me, and now if I want you to think that claim is true, I've just described something, right? But there's another layer here. I can't just describe things about the world, because if I say all unmarried men can survive in deep water, I haven't really validated that idea, right? But if I take every single unmarried man in the world and I show you their driver's license and I show you their faces and you check them off on a big clipboard and I put them all on a boat and I throw them in some water and they can all in fact swim, we've just validated that idea, right? Of course, it's impractical, but we've just validated that idea. This is called the demonstration, okay? So we have true statements, true by definition, analytics. We have descriptive statements, which are synthetic statements, but then we have demonstrations. We don't say something is true by demonstration. We say it's demonstrable, right? We don't say descriptions are true. We say descriptions are good or bad. We say, oh, he had a hoodie on and he was running that way and he had flip-flops and jeans. That's a description. That's not a definition of the criminal. Some crime is committed, right? You're describing the person, right? You have good descriptions and bad descriptions. You don't have true descriptions and not true descriptions. You have true definitions and not true definitions. Does that make sense? This is the second biggest problem is people don't understand the analytic versus synthetic distinction, okay? So I've got a little bit more, but I don't want to open another can of worms and go into all that stuff. So I'm recognizing that we're about maybe 55 minutes into this, and Les can probably tell us very well that the adult attention span is somewhere between 45 and 50 minutes, and the limit of the adult bladder is just a little bit longer than that too. So let's call that for now. And we'll take maybe a 5 or 10 minute break. And then you want to come back and do some more questions? Sound good? Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. So I'm going to kind of try to get the ball rolling a little bit and talk about some discussions I've had in the past. And talking about things that didn't go so well can be just as useful about talking about things that you felt went pretty well. Peter Bogasian, I can't recommend his book strongly enough, talks about these as interventions. It's almost like I'm intervening in someone's life. I'm having a discussion with them because they've got an addiction or a broken epistemology, and I'm going to fix their addiction with my intervention. I like the analogy. It's a little aggressive, but Bogasian's an aggressive guy. I like him a lot. So I'll quickly tell a little anecdotal story about a conversation I had last year with a girl. Very honest, very genuine interlocutor, and she said, I'm sure you've all heard this before, but what happens to you when you die? So who wants to take a whack at that? Anybody?
Nothing.
Reb. Nothing. Okay. That is a counter-apologetic. Reb says nothing. I'll try to repeat if you don't get there. Okay, nothing. That's bleak. That's unfortunate. And sometimes the answer can be bleak. It can be unfortunate. There's nothing wrong with that. Does anybody else have any ideas?
You start to decompose.
You start to decompose. Okay, cool. Fair enough. That's nothing. You start to decompose. That's cool. What about somebody else? Anyone? Okay, so what happens to you when you die? So this was a conversation I had last year. And what I did is I questioned the question, okay? I said, what do you mean by you? What's a you? What are you calling you? Okay? Oh, well, you, right? That's your definition. You can't define a word with the word itself. It doesn't work that way. That's circular, right? Okay, so I said, no, I'm just curious. When you say you, are you talking about the atoms? No, I'm talking about your soul. Okay, so how do we know a soul exists? And that's a different question, right? Because a soul has to exist for a soul to survive death. Death, as defined, by definition, remember analytics, as defined is the end, right? If you read any definition of death, it always says the end, okay? Well, it's, the afterlife. So this is a poetic way of talking about what? The soul. Well, we have to have evidence for a soul for it to exist in the first place, or how does it exist? Because there's different ways for things to exist, right? Because something can be tactile, like a lectern, or it can be conceptual, like love, like music. Because what separates music and a car alarm? They're both noises, right? But it's how we interact with it. It's how we label those ideas. Somebody could consider a car alarm music. Somebody could even use a song as a car alarm, right? But it's conceptual. So I'm not saying music doesn't exist. I'm not saying sound doesn't exist, but it exists conceptually. It is a concept, right? So does the soul exist tactilely? Is it made of material? And there's a big philosophical issue here about materialism and philosophical materialism and is everything in the universe made up of materials, just the atoms at its most basic, which is some of the slides get down here a little bit. If we kept going, we'll do next time. To be a reductionist, or to be what they call it, an eliminativist, someone who eliminates everything by its properties, and they'll say, okay, Ed's got a shirt on, it's a green shirt. Well, you take the green away, it's just a shirt. Okay, you take the materials away, you take the fibers away, you take the buttons away. He's sitting there shirtless, right? Because if you can reduce everything by its properties, how does it exist anymore? How do we agree it exists anymore? So what I said to her was, do I exist just as my atoms? Because the same atoms that were in my hand weren't the same atoms that were in my hand 10 years ago. So what part of me goes on after my own death? Because for something to happen after my own death, something has to survive my own death, something has to go on, right? So I said, I think of life as a phase transition, and I'm borrowing this from Sean Carroll, but I've changed it slightly. When you have water, take water out of the sink, and you put it in the freezer, and you come back tomorrow, what's in the cup?
Frozen water.
Frozen water, which we also call
Ice.
Ice, okay. Well, what's ice? It's just frozen water, right? Okay. So take that ice out of the freezer and you put it in a saucepan and you turn the saucepan on hot and high. You come back an hour later. What do you have? Water, possibly boiling water.
Well, half an hour, probably nothing.
Okay, yeah. Half an hour. It depends on how good your stove is. I've got an inductive stove, so mine's pretty cool. No, just kidding. You could have water vapor, you could have steam, you could have boiling water, right? Well, what is steam relative to ice, relative to water? It's just still water, right? It's still 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, right? So when you put that water from the tap in the freezer, it's just going through a phase transition. Water is turning into ice. It's still water, atomically, right? A way of talking about it, but it's just transitioning from one phase to the next. When you put it in the saucepan, it's just transitioning from one form to the next. You're either adding energy or taking energy away. You can't add cold to water. You can only take heat away. That's how thermodynamics works. But it's just a phase transition, right? It's just our way of discussing the states which we engage water with, right? 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom bonded together in a molecule, right? Okay, same idea, but you go to a Renaissance fair and you build a candle. Have you ever done that? You take a wick, a candle, you take a wick and you dip it into wax and you pull it out of the wax and you let it cool, and then you dip it back in there, and it's a wick with wax on it. You keep doing this over. When does it become a candle? Hard to say. It's conceptual, right? We assign a wick, which is just made of string, right? And wax, which is kerosene, by the way. Wax is just warm, basically warm kerosene. It's petroleum product. We assigned that property to a candle, to wick and wax, to make it a candle. We decide when it becomes a candle, right? So if you light the candle, you use a lighter, and you light the candle, it starts burning, right? What's happening? It's just phase transitioning. In the same way, when the wax cooled, when you pulled it out of the vat, the phase just transitioned from warm wax to kind of a gelatinous plasma form or phase of the wax, of the kerosene, the petroleum, right? To stick on the wick. When you light it on fire, it goes up in vapor, and it's another phase transition, right? It's just energy transitioning the phase of the matter, energy transitioning the phase of the molecules and the atoms, right? We recognize that energy release in the wick itself as a phase transition. We say, oh, it's burning, right? We assign that label to it, right? So when you blow out the candle, where does the flame go? It's a lot like asking what happens after I die if I'm just made of matter, if I'm just made of atoms, right? I am phase transitioning, right? I am transitioning all that food that I ate at Chipotle, right, into energy, into animation, what you're seeing right now. I'm just made of matter. I'm just made of atoms and molecules, right? But I'm using that energy, which I got from the sun, which the wax was doing as well, which the water was doing as well. You're just using that energy, which came from the sun, to just transition phases. So if I am just matter, and I am transitioning phases right now, when I die, colloquially, what we assign that label, just like we assign the label of a flame on wax, right, as a candle burning, when I die, I've simply stopped transitioning phases, right? What we recognize as me. This is what I told her. And she was, whoa, okay.
But we don't really know what goes after. Because that is something we cannot see, right?
What goes after for what?
the soul, for example.
Okay, so
We cannot really touch it physically. We cannot measure it. At least until now, we have not been able to. Right?
can we touch physically music?
Yes.
How?
We can measure it.
We can measure music.
Yeah.
We can. Okay, so we measure the vibrations in the medium,
Exactly.
right? And then there's a receiver, right? Your ear versus the speaker, whatever else the case may be. We can measure that. But what is music that is not a car alarm?
Again.
Music is a song, right? And a car alarm is a noise.
Right.
One is music, one is noise.
This definition, right?
Who determines what's music and what's noise?
Well, it depends on the.
So we can measure the material, right?
Yeah.
But the material is just in motion. And what put it in motion? Ultimately, the sun, the energy we got from the sun, because the same thing that makes a car speaker go off and play music came from petroleum, which is, right, came from the sun, which is the same energy that makes the car alarm go off, right? Yeah. Which is energy that came from the sun. Yeah. So it's really just energy transferring into the matter, into the molecules. And I'm not saying I'm a philosophical materialist, but if we reduce it down to its most basic components, right? Where does the music go when the speaker turns off? Where does life go when you die? Where does the candle go when you blow it out?
Well, I would say we could leave it that we don't know everything. That there's
I agree.
mark,
I don't want to hold myself out as somebody that thinks he knows everything. Yeah. But the way I conceptualize this is it's just a phase transition, and we're witnessing the end of one phase versus another. Yeah. I'm not saying I'm right, but for a soul to go on after death, a soul has to exist first. And we would need sufficient credible evidence to believe in a soul in the same way you would need sufficient credible evidence to believe in the Smurfs or whatever else.
But didn't you say that you told her you stopped transitioning?
If my matter stops phase transitioning, it would be like asking what happens to me, right? You as the flame, as the music, this thing that we conceptualize. My phase transition is me using energy from the sun to move these atoms through, because my atoms are, when I started this conversation, I had a lot fewer atoms than I do right now, because I'm off-gassing, right? So when that phase stops, say what happens after the phase change stops is just like asking what happens, where did the flame go when you blow it out?
Okay.
You follow?
Yeah.
I'm not, it's a little verbose, it's a little long-winded because we're doing this instructionally, we're going through these ideas slowly, and sometimes you got to kind of taper your response, taper your question. But we're trying to get through these ideas so we understand them, I think.
Because what I'm saying is after you die, you're still in transition, like the water to steam.
It's a different phase transition. It's transitioning phases differently. Okay. My consciousness is not transitioning that phase anymore. What we recognize as consciousness. I'm not transitioning that phase any longer. But sure, absolutely, those atoms are going to dissipate out in entropy and all that stuff. The cream into the coffee. It's going to go out into the universe, and it could get recycled, right? Sometimes living organisms get turned into compost, and other new living organisms grow out of that. From death brings life and so forth. It's cyclical, but all that energy ultimately comes from the sun, except for a very small portion of it may be geothermic, which you could say kind of still comes from the sun, because the Earth is what's left over from the sun's. I'm not science class. Phil?
I want to challenge this a little bit.
Please.
Because what you're doing is explaining to us what happens to the matter.
Sure.
And of course, I don't believe in a soul. So what we're left with here is sentience.
Sure.
That's something that was there before, then it is not there after. How would you throw that into the mix and explain the transition?
Well, I think I tried to circumnavigate this a little bit by talking about how things exist. How does sentience exist? How does sapience exist? How does consciousness exist? How does a flame exist? A flame is something we see, we can measure. You can measure these atoms moving from here to here, right? You can see a heat transfer if you're looking at the right devices, right? How does it exist? Does it exist conceptually, like music? Music is a concept. We assign that label to matter transitioning form, right? We assign that. So I'm not saying sentience doesn't exist. I'm not saying sapience doesn't exist, because I certainly hope you guys are convinced that I am sentient and I am sapient and I am conscious to having this discussion, right? That's part of the Roadrunner technique we talked about earlier. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm saying how does it exist? In what way, in what shape, in what form? And no, if we're going through argument from ignorance, which was my number one enemy if I had a magic wand, if we're talking about an argument from ignorance, you can't explain the origin of consciousness, you got me. No question about it. I can't explain the origin of consciousness. I can't explain the origin of sentience or sapience. There's arguments now that trees and plants have a certain degree of sentience, not sapience, but sentience.
So it seems that then we end up on a position of not knowing, which is what you said, and then a believer would be more of a person who is really not comfortable with that as a final
Absolutely.
answer.
Yeah, and like I said, just like talking a second ago, an argument from ignorance is my number one enemy. If I had one problem, if I could solve one problem, it'd be that. And that's what I see is I don't know. It may make you uncomfortable, but it makes me uncomfortable to know that I'm going to die someday. It makes me uncomfortable to know that my wife may not survive, the next month. I have no idea. I mean, it's macabre to think about, but just because things are uncomfortable and they make us, and it's unpleasant to think about, doesn't make them any less factual. Anybody? Less?
Wait for the mic.
And I'm just telling you what I said in the conversation and how it went over. And I remember my disclaimers. You don't have to agree. You don't have to adopt my techniques.
I guess you could say that we all leave traces behind. Everybody we've ever interacted with bears some influence from us in one way or another. And of course, if you believe the selfish gene concept,
Right.
and the genes are self-perpetuating and have not died since the beginning of whatever.
Sure.
So that's one way of looking at some kind of not dying, I suppose. It may not be totally satisfying to most people.
You live on in the memories like William Shakespeare. We still have the works of William Shakespeare. Although his atoms are no longer phase transitioning in front of us, we still have the remnants left over of his mind and his culture and what he added to it, and every other artist you can think of and thinker and so forth, the Enlightenment period. Yeah, that's a very David Smalley answer is you still live on in the lives and the minds of people that you like. But I think that's a little bit more, that's a quicker probably way to answer it. I see that as a little bit of a dodge because they're not asking, that's kind of a poetic way of talking about how you may live on. They're talking about specifics. I mean, they want to poke you in the chest and go, a minute ago you were warm and now you're cold. What happened? What's the change? I see it as a phase transition. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just, I think that's the best way to get that idea across to somebody. Anybody else? No wrong answers, just ideas. We're just exchanging ideas. I want you guys to improve my ideas. I want my arguments to get better. Phil.
I want to model this a little bit because a lot of these techniques are, let's assume that the person you're talking to is honest about what they're talking about. They're
Sure.
not trying to fool you by basically winning a
Dishonest
a debate
interlocutor, yeah.
with points. There are times to do some of these things. For example, an argument from ignorance, and you kind of talked about that. So when is it appropriate to do, or how can you tell you're doing the right thing at the right time and convince the other person when sometimes it is not always obvious that, when one person uses a form of a fallacy that's appropriate, and when the other person does it, it's inappropriate.
So you're saying, how can you tell when the technique or the method that you're employing is effective?
Well, I mean, someone can accuse you of argument from authority, and then they just go back and say, well, I have my authority, and then you're kind of just going back,
It's fake news versus fake news. Everything you don't want to hear is
How do you
fake
kind
news.
of battle that stalemate?
It could be a stalemate. There could not be a solution there. I'm not suggesting I have the best answer for that. I mean, I talked to Pierce on the street last year, and I was having a conversation with him, and his eyes lit up, and his face just lifted. He smiled. He smiles like he's smiling right now, and he was excited, and he liked the things I was saying. He's turning red. Sorry. He liked the conversation we were having, and in the same way, you see the pretty girl at the bar and you start talking to her, and her body language tells you that what you're saying is working, that the conversation you're having is agreed upon, and it's a good conversation with both of you. Body language, their responses, all that stuff are nonverbal cues. I mean, what is it? 90% of all communication is nonverbal. All that stuff. I mean, if you can't read that in a business setting or in a friendship setting, you're not going to be able to read that stuff in an apologist setting either. I got a couple questions. They're a little more generic.
When is it worth the effort to argue with somebody about religion, or just not argue about it?
That's purely a personal decision. I mean, there are people This meetup has been posted for a few weeks now, and the people that wanted to show up are interested in the subject. The people that didn't aren't. The people who buy Peter Bogasian's book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, they're interested in that kind of stuff. Like I said, I'm insatiable for this conversation, for this stuff. I seek it out. I had fan pages on websites, okay? I'm not going to tell you what my screen names were, but I was one of those guys that looked for this conversation wherever I could find it. And if you're not interested, then you're not interested. You don't have to try to convince anybody. This isn't about convincing people. This is about understanding how they're trying to convince you and seeing some of those ploys and tactics and recognize them and being able to circumnavigate those ideas before they get there. So if you're not interested, I can't make you interested in that sort of thing. To keep plugging Bogasian, he has an app called Atheists where he's got like all these different questions to ask, and they're all multiple choice answers. It's really interesting and entertaining if you're interested in this kind of stuff. And he talks about when is it worth it. He talks about doxastic closer, and then he's got 7 layers or levels of openness. Somebody who's doxastically closed. I'm not going to drag anybody's name through the mud, but people we see in these discussions frequently, they're there to send and not receive. And you can figure that out pretty quick when it's not a discussion. It's a monologue disguised as a dialogue. They're pretending to have a conversation, but they're really just there to preach. Or if that's the case, you may not be able to expose some of those fallacies or some of those underlying assumptions that person may have because they're just not open, and you can't. There's no key to get into somebody's head and flip the switch and say, okay, now you're going to be open to these ideas or not. It's unfortunate. I wish I had a better answer for you. Ed.
Well, people are arguing that it's not a purely logical or rational existence for us. There's always emotions are an important part
Sure.
in almost everything we do, and so how about just trying to understand where the person is coming from emotionally and using that to help them realize maybe that you do have a point.
Yeah, I may not be the best spokesperson for empathetic rationale with somebody's emotional state. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist. I'm just simply an enthusiast about this kind of stuff. And when somebody has an emotional appeal, you can kind of gauge how much that's impacting their epistemology, how much that's impacting their worldview. And again, just like Les's question, it's almost purely subjective. Some people you're going to be able to have these discussions with. Some people are interested in an amicable discourse, and some people are not. Some people are there to indoctrinate, wave their finger, and threaten, and carrot and stick, and coercion, and all those other techniques I talked about. That's what they're there to do. Somebody who is emotional, who has an emotional appeal, they need to work that out with somebody that's not me. That's not my role. That's not something I'm holding myself out as somebody who's able to educate people on how to handle. That's not my game. I wish I had a magic wand for that specifically. But like you said, we're all intuitive creatures. We do respond based upon emotion. We don't always get things right. And that's, I think, not to be an advocate of scientism, which is another one of those trapdoors, confusing philosophical and methodological naturalism. But that's what's so cool about science, is when you really want to get serious and down and dirty about your ideas, about whether or not they are accurate, is when you do the best work you possibly can. And just like when you have a really important email or a really important letter to send to somebody, you do it the best you can, and you read through it 20 times, and then you show it to a trusted confidant, and you say, hey, proofread this for me, please. That's one of the most important parts of the scientific method, is you have other people check your homework, and they check your homework, and then somebody else will check that person's homework, and they're going to check your checking, and then somebody else is going to check their checking of the checking of the checking. That's part of the peer-reviewed process. And what's it called, Les, when you repeat somebody's study after the fact? There's like no funding for it. That's why it doesn't get done that often. You try to get the exact same. You reproduce somebody's study, somebody's results in a separate laboratory. But that's what's so cool about the scientific method, is we remove as much of that emotion methodology as possible, and we get really honest about how we determine and determine our conclusions and have our answers for our questions. I can't say rely on science, that will solve the problem for you, but That's the best method we found so far.
I think in terms of public policy, if somebody makes an argument about what should be done in our culture with a strictly religious argument, I think we're obligated in those situations to perhaps enter that debate, because it could be that their point of view depends only on some unproven belief system that they have. And I think that's where it's important to engage people in argument about it. In terms of, if it's just in terms of does somebody believe or not, again, maybe not that important, but if it starts to influence the culture in general, then maybe that's the time you do.
Which is one of my talking points. Why can't you just leave religious people alone? I don't seek out religious people. I go to places where they may seek me out, and I'll wear, a Flying Spaghetti Monster t-shirt, and I Ask an Atheist t-shirt. I'll hold myself out as somebody who's willing to have that conversation, somebody who wants to go into that discourse with someone. I don't seek them out, because if you're going to be at home by yourself underneath the covers with the lights out and the doors locked, I don't care what you believe. You can believe whatever you want. However, when you take that belief out of the public forum, or you're going to influence somebody else's life who doesn't, and make decisions for them they can't make for themselves, like locking a child in a closet for 18 years. Now I feel there's something needs to be said, and that's not going to be fixed with an argument or so forth. But I mean, what you said in the beginning there was beautifully eloquent, just like the founding fathers. That's what the First Amendment, the first clause of the First Amendment, was all about. They're setting up the rules of the monopoly game that we're going to play for the next hundreds of years, however long this republic lasts. And they started out by saying the very most important thing was Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, because they know people get irrational about their religious beliefs, and they're going to say, no, I've got the truth. No, I've got the truth, capital T. Everybody thinks they've got it, and then they try to influence public policy. And the Founding Fathers saw that tear Europe basically apart for the Dark Ages. I mean, the borders of Europe are pretty much all designed based upon which religion, which clan was the strongest. And I mean, every country in Europe is about the same size, because that's about as much territory as one religion or one tribe, one clan could hold in that area. They saw that tear apart, and they tried to foresee that problem and try to beat it before it happened. And there's always reinterpretation and language changes of, did they really mean bear arms? Did they mean militia? And blah, blah, blah. All that other stuff comes into it. But yeah, when it comes to public policy, we're all in this together. We're all in the same life raft floating through the cosmos together. So it's, I think, worthwhile to have these type of workshops and these types of discussions and these types of debates that Phil is doing. I mean, I just looked at lunch before we came. There are 3 apologetics workshops that are being given today. Eric Hovind and a couple other guys, I couldn't remember specifically, but they're charging $150 for these things to give the opposite version, to teach people, to teach religious believers how to approach these subjects, to say, oh, what's the famous phrase from Kirk Cameron, you got to go around someone's intellect. That's what they're doing right now, is they're engaging in that. And this is happening. I mean, there's college courses. I don't know if there's majors, but there's college courses at Bible colleges all over the country where they're teaching people specifically about apologetics, about how to get into your head and convince you their religious beliefs are accurate, based nothing on argumentation, based upon sitting in an armchair and thinking about it really hard. Can you say something about self-awareness and preventing yourself from using some of these techniques inappropriately? Sure. And I think that's a really good point, and thank you for bringing that up, Phil, is a lot of these points that I brought up that were apologetics, some of the things to look out for, you will see secular advocates using from time to time, because they're like intellectual shorthand, and it's easy to rely on those things and go, oh yeah, well, you don't know, therefore X, or whatever else the case may be, or famous person so and so says X, and then they won't look it up. Fake news, that kind of stuff, right? I think, again, it was Sean Carroll in one of his chapters in his latest book said, the best way to prevent yourself from using some of these ideas and techniques that you find pernicious is to recognize your own bias. I want this to be the case. I want this to be true. I want donuts to be healthy, right? I want them to be fat-free. So if you find yourself wanting something to be the case, that is the time to up your standard of evidence, to up your expectation for substantial, credible evidence, because you recognize in and of yourself you want something to be the case, so you up the standards. In the same way, if somebody else wants something to be the case, you would hope they would up the standards. And if you want something to not be the case, that's the time to lower the standards whenever it's symmetric in that way. So that's a good technique. It's not an end all, but you have to be self-aware enough to recognize, oh, I want this to be true, so I'm going to make myself think it's true, even though I've got every reason telling me it's not to be the case. But that's when you increase your expectation for credible evidence. Done? Cool. Time's out, guys. Thanks a bunch for coming. This is going to be a series. If you've got critiques, please, I've got super thick skin. You can't hurt my feelings. Let me know what I can improve for next time. Okay? Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.